Does Borderlands as a franchise need a great story, or even just a good story to survive? Only a year or two ago, I would have answered this question with a fast no, but more recently I've opened my mind to the fact that my opinion on Borderlands 3 is the minority. I think just as my perception changed in understanding what people want out of a Borderlands game, so have the expectations of what makes a Borderlands game good. I look back at Borderlands 1 and think back to playing that game when it first came out. It's clearly a game good enough to get a franchise off the ground, yet its story is mediocre at best. Don't get me wrong, its characters and dialogue were pretty good, and the humor still gets me to this day. Borderlands 1 gameplay and its revolutionary looting system was enough to carry this game, with the story simply being a vehicle to get the player from point A to point B. Some could make the argument for its time it was doing something new and created a genre so it could get by without a good story. I wonder if people during this time just didn't mind having the story play second fiddle to the gameplay. What do you guys think? Have you played Borderlands 1? If you have, if you played it when it first came out, if you remember your feelings and everything back then without the rose-tinted glasses, let me know down below. I'm really curious to hear, did you guys care at all about the story in Borderlands 1? Was it just this, loot 'em and shoot 'em kind of game? Let me know. Then Borderlands 2 came along and brought upgraded gameplay, but also, of course, Handsome Jack. Borderlands 2's story alone was an upgrade from Borderlands 1, but still nothing mind-blowing. No tear-jerking moments, no heartfelt story. Handsome Jack alone made Borderlands 2's story great, but it took one of the greatest, if not the greatest, villain in video game history to make it great. This is where I start to wonder, in the Borderlands timeline, did the story begin to matter more to people? Was Handsome Jack so good that people began to care about some of the Borderlands story? Do you think Gearbox raised expectations on something they can't deliver on again? I mean, trying to make a game with one of video game's greatest villains isn't a consistent or sustainable way to manage your franchise. But let's hold that thought for a moment while we take a fork in the road before Borderlands 3 and talk about what is the most slept on game in the franchise, Borderlands the pre-sequel. I actually made a video looking back on Borderlands the pre-sequel, and in the first minute of the video, I talk about how Borderlands is known for its gameplay and endgame. But with Borderlands the pre-sequel, it's just not the case. As many Borderlands fans know, Borderlands the pre-sequel support died fast. After only releasing one DLC, the studio 2K Australia imploded, and during the pre-sequel's time, people just looked at this game when it first came out as a disappointment because it looked exactly like Borderlands 2 but in space. What people didn't realize is how great the story is, because most did not give pre-sequel much of a chance. I think Borderlands the pre-sequel is the greatest story in the franchise. Full stop, no apologies. It actually is the best story in the franchise. I definitely think that, and I think there's others out there low-key that think the same thing. The playable characters in Borderlands the pre-sequel are, again, some of the best in the franchise. And if you haven't given this game a second chance or a chance, I highly recommend you play this game. The story is great. There's so many good side characters. Shout out to Nakayama, one of my favorite characters that got a shameful ending in Borderlands 2, but still a funny one. Just, I wish he was still around. But Borderlands the pre-sequel was made after the fact. They didn't know how good. Randy Pitchford himself has said that he regrets ending some of the characters that Borderlands the pre-sequel made good, because they just took these characters that all die in Borderlands 2 and then made them freaking amazing. And then Randy's just like, shit, we have these amazingly well thought out characters get written just so they die in a game we already made, so it's too late. So anyways, Borderlands the pre-sequel, if you haven't played it, play it. If you played it and then quit too early, go play it. I don't care, just go play it. So anyways, with that little rant over, we'll come back to Borderlands the pre-sequel later and why it kind of throws a wrench in my understanding of what people want from Borderlands, because this is what I want to know out of this video. I want to hear from all y'all. Like, what is it that you want from Borderlands? Is it the story? Is it gameplay? Is it endgame? Is it all of the above? And to what degree do you want each of them? But anyways, let's get back to it. And up next is Borderlands 3. When it comes to this game, my opinion seems to be the minority. I love Borderlands 3, even though its story has terrible pacing. Like, genuinely some of the worst I've played personally. And the villains are not that funny and really don't feel threatening. So I'm not feeling as strongly about the villains, but I do hear the consensus and get it as to why the villains of Borderlands 3 aren't that big. They're not my favorite either. I don't really hate them, but I'm not loving them. I love Borderlands 3 because of its major upgrade to gameplay and diverse playstyles, combined with an endgame that has tons of content and really nails a good feeling of progression, synergy, and letting you be a complete and total badass. But, and this is a huge but, most people did not stick around for Borderlands 3's post-launch support. Its DLC and free updates adding new endgame content and new loot. Gearbox added 22 levels to the game for free, but nobody really talks about it when they charged people for more level ups in Borderlands 1 and Borderlands 2. Borderlands 3 added new endgame content to play through for free with new weapons, and some of them being the best loot in the game to this day. Now at launch, Borderlands 3 had some missteps, like poor optimization, updates nerfing too much, raid bosses missing, and legendaries being too common was another loud complaint. This all caused a lot of people to fall off and never really come back, even though Borderlands 3, one of the best post-launch deliveries I've ever seen personally. They stopped nerfing for a very long time and only did it a handful of times, so things like the recursion wouldn't break people's games, although one I'll never get behind was nerfing Tediore. But my point being, Borderlands 3 now has everything in my opinion to be a great looter shooter with amazing endgame and plenty of fun content to run through, but people never came back. Was it the story and villains for Borderlands 3? Was it how Borderlands 3 launched? Or was it legendaries were too common? Was it all three? Or was it something more? Genuinely asking, I want to hear from you guys down below, like, what was it for Borderlands 3 if you never came back, or you came back and still weren't into it, or whatever it was. Like, I want to hear it all down below. I'm just really curious what about Borderlands 3 was such a huge turnoff and part of Gearbox's downfall in the reputation they stand in now. So now we go back to Borderlands, the pre-sequel, and this is a game that had no endgame and no post-launch support beyond one DLC, but incredible story, amazing playable characters, and personally, in my opinion, hilarious side quests. And the one DLC they had was legitimately one of the best DLCs in Borderlands franchise. I know I'm being so extra about how great Borderlands the pre-sequel was, but seriously, if you haven't played it, go play it. Borderlands the pre-sequel is the most slept on in the franchise, in my opinion, especially with the amount of noise around Borderlands 3 and how its story turned away so many people, but yet Borderlands the pre-sequel also turned away many people at launch due to the fact that it's still on the same engine as Borderlands 2 and wasn't seen as an upgrade. But if you do go back and play it, its story, its playable characters are so fun, and it's just a great game. So I really recommend you just give it a chance, while just keeping in mind, listen, there's not gonna be an end game here. You're just gonna play through it, and it's a really fun playthrough. And now we go back to Borderlands 3, which had what most would sum up as a bad to terrible story, but with amazing gameplay and a plethora of incredible content now. But did it all come too late? Borderlands the pre-sequel, as I've said numerous times, has great story gameplay from Borderlands 2, but no real endgame. Borderlands 2 has good gameplay, a good enough story, with one of the greatest video game villains of all time, but due to when it came out, it was missing modern day mechanics like mantling over walls and such, and its endgame, it feels controversial nowadays to me. I mean, without Borderlands 3, it was probably just seen as a good endgame, but it feels like nowadays Borderlands 2's endgame versus Borderlands 3 endgame is like a big controversy. But maybe that's just me as somebody that prefers Borderlands 3's endgame. And then there's Borderlands 1 being the first of its franchise got by simply by being a genre creator with great humor and characters. If we take all these into consideration and what each got right and wrong, it makes the franchise feel inconsistent with what it does good and bad. The most consistent piece of each game is that the gameplay is good. But is that enough for Borderlands 4 to succeed? Does its story need to be great? Does the villain need to be great with a decent story? I think one thing is for certain, and that is Borderlands 4 needs to be good at launch with minimal missteps. Borderlands 3 shows that first impressions are everything, and you will lose a major portion of your player base without a good launch, even if you have great post-game launch support. So I'm genuinely asking you guys, what is needed on day one? I think it needs either a great story or great villain, but more so the latter. I think the villain seems to be more important than the story, but the story needs good pacing. I think without good pacing, people kind of, tend to meander with their minds and get bored. And, when you're sitting there at Sanctuary for the billionth time visiting Lilith, you tend to get bored really fast and say, oh my God, how many times do I have to come back to this lady? And then you watch these holographic people just talking at your group on Sanctuary, and you just can't do anything, and you have to wait for it to be over even though you've already seen it 10 billion times. Anyways, I'm done ranting about why Borderlands 3 pacing is terrible. I think the gameplay for Borderlands 4, being what we've seen, is more than most expected already, so I expect, just like all prior Borderlands games, the gameplay will be good, if not great. In my opinion, through the trailers and everything, Borderlands 4's gameplay looks fan-freaking-tastic and looks so fun. So, in conclusion, for the franchise to survive, yeah, I think Borderlands 4 needs at least a good story. I think Borderlands 2 raised a lot of expectations, and incidentally, Borderlands 3 made expectations higher, along with other mistakes Gearbox has made recently. I think people really need to see Gearbox pull off a great game for many to consider to come back. But what do you guys think? Am I right? Is there anything in here that you think I'm completely off about? And what do you think people want out of Borderlands? What do you want out of Borderlands? Let me hear it down below. Do you think Gearbox has been inconsistent with the quality of this franchise? That's just about everything I had to say here about Borderlands. And yeah, I think it does need a good story now to be able to pull off survival. Personally, I like straight up just survival. I know that sounds so dramatic, but I think that Gearbox put themselves in a really bad spot with Borderlands 3, and it didn't come off great to a lot of Borderlands fans. And then on top of that, you had New Tales, and you had Wonderlands, and you had the movie, which really cratered the reputation for your whole franchise. It's just, your Gearbox put themselves in a very rough spot, and I think the story is a big part of what will save them. I think we've seen enough of the gameplay. Well, I wouldn't say enough. I think we've seen a vertical slice of the gameplay that looks freaking fantastic, but I really need to see more. I mean, of course, because we haven't seen much. I think the gameplay is going to be fine. I trust Borderlands with gameplay. It's the one thing they've been consistent on. I just think that if the story isn't at least good, I think it needs to be great, honestly. At this point, I think they really need to pull off like just firing on all cylinders with this game at launch. But maybe I'm just being overly dramatic about where they are and everything. Let me know down below. And I'm just rambling at this point, so I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace out.